Let's start with today's lecture. So, at the end of our last meeting, we discussed the relationship between church and state in Imperial Russia from 1721 up until the first Russian Revolution in 1905. Now, today we're going to go to look more at people rather than institutions, to look at the very front line of the Orthodox Church, its parish clergy. These were the people who represented the Orthodox Church in the daily lives of millions and millions of citizens, of subjects of the Russian Empire. And they had a unique way of life, unique conditions, that not only bestowed benefits, but caused them, as individuals and as a group, a large number of problems. And these problems and tensions were certainly on the rise by the time of the First Russian Revolution in 1905. So I want to start today by introducing you to some concepts which you will come across in your reading and which we will discuss today. And the first notion you'll see often discussed is this idea of clerical estate, or social estate more generally. Now, this is a difficult concept sometimes to get across to modern people, or especially because the Russian term for estate, soslovia, doesn't necessarily translate well into the English word estate. But nonetheless, it's something you have to confront. Now, today, in the modern world, we have this kind of notion of, of social class. That's how society is given a hierarchy. We often talk most generally in terms of working, middle, and upper class, for instance. But class is not an estate, because class is defined by things like culture, by income, by educational standards, by profession. I don't know how important class is today in modern Estonia or in modern Italy, for instance. But in United Kingdom, which is still a very traditional society, class is still considered extremely important. But class is not a legally regulated category. It is not something that is defined, that gives you different legal rights, different legal privileges under law. Of course, you may possess different practical privileges belonging to, say, the upper class as opposed to the working class. But these privileges, technically speaking, do not exist under law. All citizens are equal in the vast majority of modern European states, modern Western states, let's say. Equal under the eyes of the law. However, an estate and the estate system is a form of social hierarchy and categorization which is firmly fixed into law. In the Russian Empire, there are, broadly speaking, 5 social estates. There is the noble estate, the peasant estate, the clerical estate, the merchant's estate, and the townspeople. And these are legal categories which fix and determine the privileges and responsibilities that the members of each estate have to bear. So, for instance, being a member of the peasant estate means that you are subject to conscription, and you are subject to the poll tax. Being a member of a noble estate means you are not subjected to conscription or to poll tax. And unlike in modern society, where social mobility is encouraged, indeed deemed to be a marker of a successful society, movement between social estates in the Russian Empire is not encouraged. The empire and its government, generally speaking, do not want people transiting upwards and downwards between the various social states. They want people to remain within the category in which they are born. Usually, generally speaking, in the empire, you are born and you die within the same social estate. Okay? This isn't like class where, for instance, one can get you can be born working class, but you might get an education, you might get a very high-paying job, and you might be able to achieve a degree of sociability, achieve a middle class or an upper class standard of existence. And that is an encouraged notion, an encouraged idea among the ideologies of modern states. Think of the notion of the American dream, for instance, which has precisely the idea that someone who comes from nothing can achieve the very highest. That precisely is not the idea governing an estate-based system. Talking of the clerical estate, then, in Russia, it includes everybody who is in some way connected to the church. So I mean priests, I mean the sons and daughters of priests, the wives of priests, nuns, bishops, but also anybody who tends to work with the church, servants in monasteries. Before the 1760s and the secularization of church land, the monastery peasants. All of these people are considered to belong to the clerical estate. This notion of estate plays a huge role in how the clergy develop over the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, another concept you're going to come across is ecclesiastical domain. Again, it's difficult to translate the Russian into English precisely, but ecclesiastical domain is the best we can get. That's relatively simple and straightforward. And basically, this refers to the entire area of Russian life which belongs to the church. It can be best understood in distinction from the so-called secular domain. So the secular domain is everything that belongs to the jurisdiction of a secular government. So the ecclesiastical domain is everything that belongs to the jurisdiction of a church. Okay? These are two concepts, clerical estate and ecclesiastical domain, which are going to come up both in your reading and within this lecture. I hope I've been clear. Has anyone got any questions? No? Okay, good. So another point about terminology. So you're going to hear about the white clergy and the black clergy. What do we mean by this distinction? Well, white clergy were basically the priesthood. They were the people who served in they were priests who served in village and city churches and the various ranks of the priesthood. The black clergy were monks and nuns. And because bishops were monks and nuns, bishops also belonged, bishops were monks, never nuns. Bishops belonged to the black clergy, okay? So the priesthood, basically, is the white clergy, and monastics are the black clergy. Now, in Orthodox, I wanted to also talk about some facts about priests. In Orthodoxy, the priests were normally married. This is because it was before they were ordained, in other words, before the holy ritual that turned them into a priest was conducted, they were encouraged to marry. This meant, as a group, generally speaking, the Russian Orthodox clergy were married and had children. So this is distinct from, say, the Catholic Church, which, of course, forbids any kind of sexual relations in its priesthood. The Orthodox clergy were married and they had children. Now, of course, after you were ordained, that is, after you were made into a priest, then you weren't allowed to marry again. If your wife died while you're a priest, well, tough luck. You can't marry again without leaving the priesthood. Generally, what is expected is if you don't marry before you become a priest, or if you don't marry again after your wife has died while being a priest, then you become what is known as you become a monk. You become, in fact, a hero monk, which is a form of monk who is given the power to perform the sacraments in a church. Okay? And by the way, this is still the case in most Orthodox countries across the world. It's also the case in Greece, Serbia, is that generally speaking, if you're training to be an Orthodox priest, you marry before becoming the priest, okay? And then, and it's still considered, the second marriages of priests is still considered forbidden in Orthodoxy. Any questions there? No? Good. And finally, we've got some bits of terminology which I should relating to the types of the white clergy. So the priest is, generally speaking, is the highest member of the white clergy. In other words, the priest is the head of the church, the person in charge of an individual parish or church. This is the highest rank of the white clergy. Beneath them are deacons. They are also ordained, that is to say, they have a holy, when they become deacons, they have a holy ritual performed upon them in order to occupy the position of deacon. And they are usually assistants to the priest. And beneath them there are various terms for this. Here I've given you sacristan. They're also sometimes called psalmists, sometimes called sextons. Unfortunately, again, sometimes there's no precise translation from the Russian or the Greek into English, but here we'll call them sacristians. These are non-ordained members of the clergy. So in other words, they haven't had a special ritual that allows them to perform the liturgy and the sacraments. And they are often people who just take care of the church. Often they are things like choir masters. They are people who take care of the building. They often deal with a lot of the junior, more bureaucratic tasks. But they are not allowed to perform the sacraments. The deacons and the priests, because they are ordained, can perform the sacraments. Sacristans cannot, because they are not ordained. Okay? I've probably put that, okay. That will come, the last fact on that slide will come in handy later, but we'll discuss this in a minute. So, one of the foundational elements of what made the priests in Imperial Russia a distinctive group was education. Because for all intents and purposes, they possessed their own exclusive education system, which bestowed on them not only a particular set of knowledge, but a particular set of experiences and a particular way of looking at the world, which very much defined what it was to be a priest in Imperial Russia. So I just briefly want to go over the origins of this educational system before we dive more deeply into the social lives of the Orthodox priests. So, before Peter the Great, 16th, 17th century Russia, well, there really wasn't much in terms of official clerical education. Two ecclesiastical academies had been founded in Kiev in the 1650s, 1640s, 1650s, in Kiev, which of course, as you may remember from one of our lectures, when Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire in 1686, well, the Russian Orthodox Church therefore gained Kiev's ecclesiastical academy, the so-called Latino-Greco-Slavonic Academy. There was another such academy at the time in Moscow. But very basically, these academies only really trained the elites, the very highest elites of the Russian Orthodox Church in the 17th and early 18th centuries. They did not have large class sizes, and in fact, often Nobles, aristocrats sent their sons there to receive an education. So it wasn't really a purely church educational system either. Now, in terms of the system elsewhere, outside of Moscow and Kiev, two rather large cities, as far as we can determine, there didn't really exist much in the way of educational system, of schools or of ways of learning, of learning literacy, basic arithmetic, basic knowledge of the church and the liturgy. We have some documents which suggest in some regions maybe there were schools, but it's quite questionable whether they existed in reality. We simply don't know. We don't have a documentation to prove whether they existed or not. Most likely, the vast majority of priests in 16th and 17th century Russia were either illiterate or semi-literate, barely able to read, basically. Because generally speaking, at this point, the qualification to be a priest is that you are able to memorize the specific prayers and chants. And these are passed down not from books, not from book learning, but of course from your father. Or if your father wasn't a priest, from somebody else, from your senior in the church. In other words, before Peter, there is extremely limited clerical education available in Russia. The priests, in terms of their education, were not much better off, in the vast majority of cases, than the peasants, the townsmen to whom they attended. This changes markedly in the 18th century. Just as there was an administrative revolution in the church, we can also, with the establishment of more dioceses, the establishment of new bureaucratic organs functioning both in the centre and the provinces, we can also talk about an educational revolution. Because by the end of the 19th century, every diocese of the Russian Empire had managed to establish a seminary. A seminary, just in case, just to give you a definition, basically a church a church upper school, basically. Quite appropriate singing going on in the background. Any case. Oh, if you're cold, don't worry, it doesn't bother me to sing. It's okay. Anyway. And of course, with the establishment of seminaries in every diocese, the number of pupils rose. And it wasn't just because there was the availability of education. It was because the state needed educated priests throughout the Russian Empire. Remember, I talked a few lectures ago how Peter the Great imposed state bureaucratic duties on the priests. He expected them to conduct, for instance, to read out edicts from the government. He expected them to conduct surveys, to compile statistics about their parishes and send them to the central government. Well, obviously you need, therefore, an educated clergy to do these tasks. You need people who can read and write. And if you want them to instruct the people how to be more rational, sophisticated, better living, industrious individuals, and of course you need a better educated class of clergymen. And so the state, by the end of the 18th century, insists that, first they insist that you need to attend some seminary education. By 1814, they insist that completing a seminary course is obligatory for all priests. Now it's kind of hard, again, so basically in the course of a century, the priesthood has gone from being a best semi-literate group to being a group possessing almost universally some kind of education, some kind of literacy, some kind of knowledge about the rest of the world, about their own faith, and about Russia itself. They essentially became the second most educated social group in the Russian Empire. Only after the nobility, who of course invested huge amounts of money in educating their sons and daughters. I should mention, by the way, in this lecture today, we're going to talk mostly about priests and their sons. In a few weeks, I think we'll have a lecture on women in Russian Orthodoxy, where we will discuss the wives of priests and the daughters of priests in greater detail. So today, mostly we're talking about men. And there were certainly, in the 19th century, efforts educating clerical daughters and clerical wives, who had their own schooling system. The sort of cornerstone of this educational revolution was finally the establishment of the ecclesiastical academies, basically church universities. When you went to an ecclesiastical academy, you got a degree. You got a bachelor's, master's, or doctorate degree from the ecclesiastical academies. These were, in other words, the highest point. And by 1808, between 1808 and 1814, what had essentially been created was an entire hierarchy of church education, going from the most junior schools, where children as young as 5 or 6 could receive basic instruction, all the way up into these universities, where you could receive the most advanced kind of religious and also secular knowledge available at the time. The 4 academies were in really what were the 4 of the most major cities of the Russian Empire: St. Petersburg and Moscow, of course, Kiev, because it was one of the ancient religious capitals, and Kazan. And in Kazan, the academy was placed in Kazan because Kazan was part of was Russia's so-called window on the east. It was a missionary outpost for attempts to convert Muslims in the Russian Empire, attempts to convert Buddhists, and so on and so forth, and peoples in Siberia. Yes. So basically, within the course of just a bit over a century, education in church education in the Russian Empire has been completely revolutionized. There is now a fully established hierarchy stretching from the youngest point of a clerical child's life up until the very highest, offering varied and different types of education. Now, we're going to come back to this, to what education was actually like in the system in a second, because the reality departed quite significantly from the ideal, as is usually the case. But now I want to talk a bit more about the priests themselves. So firstly, I've given you the figure here, basically, of the priests in this period. And as you can see, they undergo prodigious growth in the 18th century. From the end of Peter the Great's reign, in 1725, about 61,000 members, to almost doubling that figure, almost 110,000, a century later, in 1824. So how did one, before this educational revolution, before the establishment of seminaries, before the establishment of all these new systems trying to teach priests to be educated people, how did one become a priest? Well, in the 17th century Russia, generally prevalent was the idea of clerical election. And what clerical election meant was that your parishioners, the people in the parish, would choose who is going to be their priest, and they would vote. Often they would choose the son of a priest, but not always. And then they would put that choice to the approval of the bishop. The bishop would then generally summon the chosen individual to visit him in the main city of a diocese, where he would undergo an examination, basically being asked various questions about the basics of faith, being asked to perform the basic rituals of the church. And if the elected candidate met the standards of the bishop, well, then ordination would occur. Of course, this is this process is relatively difficult to undertake. It's expensive to travel and to stay with the bishop for what could be 2 or 3 months in a town or a city that could be many, many kilometers distant from where your parish church and your home was located. But the simple fact was that with the reforms of Peter the Great, this system of clerical election becomes obviously less desirable. Why does the system of clerical election become less desirable? Well, of course, they want to ensure that the right person becomes a priest, the person with the right education and the right qualifications. They don't want parishioners to be electing just anybody, which parishioners could do. It was within their right to do so. And so gradually, step by step, the right of clerical election dies out in the Russian Orthodox Church, as bishops prefer more and more to impose their own candidates on parishes. And essentially, by the beginning of the 19th century, clerical election no longer existed in the Russian Orthodox Church. In other words, the laity no longer had any choice about who was their priest. Now later, by the end of the 19th century, this was a matter of controversy and debate about whether this was the right way to go about things. But at the time, this is what was established. People no longer elected their priests. So then how did you become a priest? So this is an important fact to remember. We say, as I just stated, to become a priest, you were now obliged, at the end of the 18th century, obliged by law to have some seminary education, or by the beginning of the 19th, a full seminary certificate. Now, in some regions of the empire, this rule is wavered a bit. For instance, in Siberia, where they have very few candidates for priests, sometimes they allow people who have not completed the seminary, people who have not completed the seminary with good grades, or have only done a bit of seminary education, to become priests. But in the central regions of Russia, in the populated regions of Russia, it is generally considered to be obligatory to have a seminary certificate to become a priest. But what was the problem then? Seminaries were only open to members of the clerical state. If you were a peasant, if you were a townsperson, a merchant, or a noble, you were not allowed to attend a seminary, largely because the seminaries were themselves funded by the priesthood. The priesthood were exempt from most taxes, but they paid church taxes, and those church taxes paid for the seminary. And so obviously, most priests, and the synod itself, did not want the taxes of churchmen going to paying towards the education of children from the peasantry, from the merchantry, and so on and so forth. They wanted to pay for their own children. And of course, the priests wanted to send their sons to the seminaries because that was the guarantee of a future career. You had to have a certificate to become a priest. So in other words, the seminaries were almost exclusively dominated by the sons from the clergy. This basically meant, therefore, that it is impossible to become a priest unless you are the son of a priest. This combined adversely with the conditions after the synod, after the secularization of church lands in 1764. The church could not pay a salary to its priests. It was now dependent on the state budget, which always allocated too little to the church for it ever to be able to pay its clergy salaries. So what did that mean? It meant if you're a priest, you were not going to receive wages, and you were not going to receive, generally speaking, a pension from the state or from the synod. So you had to guarantee your retirement and your old age, and perhaps the old age of your wife, and the guarantee the living of any dependents you had, by ensuring that your son inherited your position. And if you didn't have a son, well then, your son-in-law. In other words, you got your daughter to marry someone from the seminary, and they would guarantee to provide for you in your old age. So what happens then is that the clerical estate is not only becomes more than just an estate, it becomes almost equivalent to an Indian caste. It is impossible to join and impossible to leave. We'll go into why it was impossible to leave in a second. And the priesthood essentially became hereditary. Parish jobs passed from father to son, or from father to son-in-law. And of course, this means you essentially get clerical dynasties established. Areas where churches are controlled by members of a single family. And they're passed down and passed through that family, through marriage links. From my own research, I can tell you here in the Baltic, the same names recur over and over and over again. Both Russian names and Estonian names. And it's not because they're different, they belong to different families, they're the same families. They're using this strategy of providing for themselves, of trying to guarantee their sons a career, and of providing themselves after retirement. Now, this produces some adverse consequences. For a start, the synod is strictly against the idea that the priesthood can simply be something passed down from father to son, or that a church can be passed down from father to son. A parish and its income can be passed down from father to son. The synod is against this and repeatedly tries to regulate against it. But the reality is, and the synodal bishops knew this was the reality, without a pension system, there was very little way in which you could guarantee the retirement, old age of old priests, unless their sons or their son-in-laws took the positions. You had other sort of negative factors. For instance, a priest with lots of daughters would take, it was quite commonly noted in the 18th and until about the 1860s, that a priest would take his daughters to a seminary town, a town where the seminary was located, and host a bridal show, where he would attempt to marry off his daughters to a seminarian, in the hope then that the son-in-law would agree to come and serve in his parish, and therefore provide money and provide money for him once he retired, and support him, his wife, and any other family members once he retired. And of course, in this context, you also have to understand that clerical daughters are a burden rather than an advantage. Clerical daughters, you have to pay a dowry. A dowry is this payment you make to the father of the groom, to the father of the man upon marriage, in order so that your daughter is taken care of in her new family. So, of course, daughters impose an economic burden. A lot of daughters imposes an economic burden on priestly families. And of course, let me just be clear, this is before contraception or abortion or parental planning or anything like this. Priests' families could be huge. You know, I was talking to you about Wormsey. The first Orthodox priest of Wormsey had 8 children. Of course, belonging to the clerical estate, however, did have its privileges. legal privileges established, which elevated the estate above the lower ones, above the peasantry, above the townsmen, to a degree above the merchantry. So they were exempt from the poll tax, for instance. That was the main form of tax paid in Russia up until about the 1860s, 1870s. Of course, they didn't pay the poll tax, but of course they did pay other forms of tax, which went directly to the church. Taxes to pay for the seminary, for instance. From about the end of the 18th century, they were exempt from corporal punishments. In other words, they could not be hit or beaten as a form of punishment from the end of the 18th century onwards. Unlike peasants and townsmen, who could have that form of punishment imposed upon them. Typically, they were immune from conscription. So in other words, they could not be sent into the army. Well, in fact, one of the major conflicts between church and state in the 18th century is because the clerical estate starts providing too many sons, too many people who have no jobs for them. The state starts to try to recruit them into the army. And the synod tries to oppose this. But generally speaking, you, as a member of the clerical estate, remember this legally defined group, which you were born into and typically you died into, which defined your privileges and your limitations. One of those privileges was you couldn't be conscripted into the army. Another one was that generally, if you committed an offence, then the court, most offences, unless they were treason or something like this, most offences would be dealt with not by the secular law courts, but rather by the court of the bishop. So the church courts. And generally speaking, you would probably get a somewhat fairer hearing in the church courts than you probably would get in the secular court if you were a priest. So, at the end of the 18th century, the educational revolution, combined with the systems of how the educational revolution by the end of the 18th century had combined with these strategies of trying to maintain income, to maintain older parish members, had combined to create a rather problematic situation for the clergy. Firstly, the clergy had to pay for the seminaries. And as we're going to go into in a second, the clergy were not a wealthy group, generally speaking. Paying for these seminaries imposed an additional financial burden on what was already quite a destitute group. Secondly, by attending the seminaries, priests, of course, became educated. They came to know foreign languages, they came to know modern literature. They expanded their horizons. But when sent back to the village to interact with peasants who had mostly no education, or at the very, or perhaps rudimentary education, well, of course, this education led priests to regard themselves as higher, as creatures above their parishioners. A social divide, in other words, emerged between peasant parishioners and the clergy because of the success of the educational reforms. A distance emerged between pastors and the flock. I just mentioned, because it was impossible to leave the clerical estate, or very difficult and undesirable to leave the clerical estate, and because all clerical sons were gaining seminary certificates, what you end up with is in the 1760s, is a growing amount of priest sons who have no positions to go to. Remember, the priests have big families. They send all of their sons to the seminaries because that's how, with a seminary certificate, is how they get a position. But there can't possibly be enough parishes for all of these priests. And so you have another difficult situation emerges, where basically you have superfluous, useless priestly sons hanging around their father's parish. The father is going to have to pay for them to eat, but they can't get a position. They can't get a position elsewhere. There simply aren't the parishes for them. The state tries to ease this by recruiting them into the army. The synod opposes this, and the clerical estate opposes this. The synod because it violates the church's autonomy. The clerical estate because if you go into the army, then you're no longer a member of the clerical estate. You join the lower estates, or the peasantry or the townsmen, and you become subject to things like poll tax and corporal punishment. This problem grows and grows and grows until about, and we're going to discuss the problems it causes in the 1820s. And the major problem is it is extremely difficult and undesirable to leave the clerical estate, to go and take other positions. The synod, initially the state and the synod had agreed upon this. Make it difficult to leave the clerical estate so we can keep our educated priestly sons in the estates so we have enough educated priests to go to the countryside. Initially that had been a sound strategy, but then from the 1760s, especially by the end of the 18th century, of course, it's changed. You now have too many sons. Too many superfluous, useless priests, useless people trained as priests. These people don't want to become peasants and townsmen because peasants and townsmen are subject to poll tax, to conscription, corporal punishment. They would, in other words, by exiting the clerical estate, lose their privileges. The state itself made it difficult to leave the clerical estate. For instance, I've given you some examples here. If you voluntarily left the clerical estate, you had to leave your home province for 10 years, and you could not take employment in the civil service. In other words, a government office. Of course, the government offices were the most attractive place for priests' sons who received education to go, because the government offices always needed people, and they needed literate people. The state itself attempted to block and punish people who voluntarily left the estate. So in other words, you have an increasingly growing number of people trapped within the clerical estate, of sons trapped in the clerical estate who cannot find a position, a position in a church, and are so becoming a burden, a financial burden on their families. Is there anything I haven't mentioned? Okay, let's go and look forward. Let's go forward then and look at some other problems. So I've already mentioned this, but I'll go through it again. The priests in the Russian Empire, partially until the 1830s, 1840s, did not receive salaries, either from the state itself or from the church, the synod. Often the case was that the church had some land attached to it, some agricultural land, and the priest and his family would be expected to work that land, just like their peasant parishioners. It's noted that, in fact, until about the 1840s, if you went to a village on any day apart from a Sunday, the priest was virtually indistinguishable from a peasant because they dressed in the same clothes to do the same farm work. Now, for many priests, especially in the 19th century, this is a problem. They've received an education. They view farm work as being degrading. And it certainly doesn't elevate the status of the priesthood to see your Holy Father digging in the dirt just like you do most days of the week in order to try and produce a crop. And also, of course, the peasants generally didn't want to give land to the church or the priest, and so therefore could introduce tension between parishioners and the clergy. Another source of the priest's income was essentially to charge money for conducting rites and ceremonies. So the priest would usually would charge some money for, let's say, a baptism, a funeral, a marriage, a blessing. The priest. But this, of course, caused some problems. It meant that for the majority of their income, the priests were dependent on the very people that they were supposed to guide, on the very people they were supposed to regulate, on the very people they were supposed to instruct. It could often be, for instance, so let's consider, for instance, the synod, even at the end of the 18th century, insisted on that the priest be someone who stand against excessive alcohol consumption in the parish. Now imagine you are essentially a paid servant of your parishioners to conduct rituals, and then you turn around to your employer and you say, well, you should not get drunk so much, or you should not be so superstitious. Well, your parishioners are hardly likely to listen to you, given that they pay your salary. But on the other hand, the synod is insisting you need to quash out drunkenness, superstition in your parish. You need to strongly stand against heresy. So basically, the priest is stuck between a rock and a hard place, if I can say it using the English phrase. Above him is the synod and the bishop telling him, you must enforce these standards upon the people. And below him are the people who pay his salary, saying, well, I quite like drinking and superstition. And of course, this can cause tense relationships as well between the priests and their parishioners. Because, well, let's say you do a baptism and say, well, that would be 3 rubles, please. Well, then the parishioners might turn around and say, well, I think that's rather expensive, Father. We would like to pay 2 rubles. And then you're haggling over the cost, basically arguing over the cost of these rituals. Of course, it doesn't look good that your Holy Father, your connection to the divine world, is arguing with you over the money for the performance of a divine service.
And he can kick you because the court is broken.
Precisely. So let's just quickly, again, just to revise, duties of the priest, of course, were the first thing they were purely religious roles, performing the liturgy, particularly on a Sunday in the church, so in other words, the Eucharist and the various other sacraments, confession, different various other church rituals, which could include, for instance, conducting a cross around the boundaries of the parish, blessing holy water, blessing the waters of the village during the festival of Epiphany, etc., etc., etc. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, the state, beginning with Peter the Great, ever increasing onwards, imposed certain bureaucratic duties, the collection of statistics, for instance. So when a child was born and baptized, the priest had a book which he had to note it down in. When he conducted a marriage, he had to note down the names of the people getting married. If someone died, he had to note down the name of the people getting married. If someone came to confession, he had to note who was being confessed and how many people in his village did not attend confession. These books, by the way, were regarded with extreme importance by both the state and the church hierarchy. forging them, or in other ways destroying them, was punishable not only with a fine, but with being thrown out of the church. Fiddling with these books, making mistakes in them, or altering them intentionally was extremely harshly punished. Precisely because these books are the data collecting mechanisms upon which both the state and church relied on, almost solely throughout the imperial era until much later into the 19th century. Generally, especially in the 18th, early 19th centuries, priests were not really obliged to do some of the things we would expect a priest to do today. So, for instance, priests didn't really give out sermons. That is to say, they didn't give a reading or a lecture during or after the service. In part, this was because homiletics, that is the art of preaching, was very poorly taught in the seminaries, and in part because the church and the state imposed quite strict censorship regulations up until the 1860s on what priests could and could not speak about. And if you wanted to give a sermon, well, you had to write down your sermon, send it to the synod's censorship body, and wait for it to be passed. And of course, this was an extremely time-consuming process, especially if you're sending, let's say, your sermon all the way from Irkutsk to St. Petersburg, where the censorship committee sat, and waiting for it to return to receive permission. So many priests did not give sermons, as usually you would expect today in Orthodox churches. They performed the liturgy, they performed the rituals of the liturgy. They did not seek to instruct their spiritual flocks. Teaching, the synod did at least conceive or encourage priests to teach. But certainly it was very rare before the end of the 19th century that most priests engaged consistently in some kind of teaching activities. Priests, in other words, are generally regarded by their flocks not as teachers, not as spiritual leaders, but as people who give out the holy sacraments. And in a few weeks' time, we'll see why the rituals of the church meant so much to the peasant parishioners, what they meant in terms of the magical and mysterious world in which most peasant parishioners lived in. Now, I promised you a bit about seminary experiences, about the thing that formed a lot of priestly consciousnesses coming in the 18th and 19th centuries. The reality and the ideal were very far apart. But basically, let's start with the basic facts. Most priestly sons entered about the age of 8 or 9, although there were quite a number who did enter much older. It was possible, if you were the son of a priest, to enter a seminary 14, 15 even, and then conduct what was usually a 6-year study of course. From the very earliest point that seminaries began to be introduced, a European classical curriculum was exclusively encouraged by the synod. The synod and most of its hierarchs argued that for Orthodox priests to be treated as prestigious individuals by both the nobility and by the priests and religious figures of other confessions in the empire, then they had to study according to a European classical curriculum. And what that basically meant was you studied Latin. You didn't study Greek until much later in the course, and you certainly didn't study Old Church Slavonic. Old Church Slavonic being the language in which the liturgy of the Orthodox Church is conducted. Latin was the language of instruction in most seminaries up until about the 1840s, when Russian finally replaced it. And that was opposed by some quite important churchmen, by the way, some important bishops, precisely because Well, the priests know Latin, and that's a mark of their special distinctive status. And the way Latin, of course, was taught isn't the way modern languages are taught, or languages are taught today. It's rote instruction. You just learn words by repeating them over and over and over and over again. Repeating grammatical rules over and over and over again, without learning their contextual use, and so on and so forth. So the Latin wasn't particularly useful. I can give you a pretty good example of how insane this craze came to be. Platon Lovshin, who was Metropolitan of Moscow in the end of the 18th century, wrote one of the first modern histories of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russian. The copies of this found in most seminary libraries were translations from Russian into Latin. So in other words, even a textbook that had been prepared in Russian by a Russian Orthodox bishop was translated into Latin and sent to seminaries. And for another matter, the curriculum was very crowded. The number of subjects you were expected to study as a priest was extremely large. And it only grew larger as the state's demands and expectations on the clergy grew. In 1840, this is the reign of Nicholas I. Again, the priests are being looked to as a potential class of people who can monitor the countryside, who can engender faith, who can engender patriotism. They're engendered as being the potential leaders of the countryside. And so the reforms of the curriculum impose even more subjects, 26 subjects. In the course of these 6 years, you're expected to study. And this wasn't simply Latin. This was Latin, modern Russian, Russian history, geography, mathematics, agriculture, medicine, law to some extent, theology, modern European languages like German or French. Also some aspects of the modern sciences like chemistry, physics, biology. The idea, of course, was to try and transform the clergy into the priest into a leadership figure, someone who could provide his peasants, parishioners, for example, with knowledge about the latest techniques in modern agriculture, who could provide medical assistance in the parish. But of course, as you can imagine, trying to be taught all these subjects within a short amount of time generally meant they were covered only very, very briefly and in a very limited amount of depth. And the seminaries themselves the physical conditions of the seminaries themselves did not help matters when it came to producing an educated clergy. They were hugely underfunded. After all, they were dependent on taxes paid by already quite poor priests. They did not, in general, receive money from the state, or indeed from the synod's budget. This meant they were kept in buildings that increasingly aged, increasingly entered into poor conditions. They could not afford good salaries for their teachers, so therefore attracted lower quality teaching. They could not afford to pay for new modern textbooks, for new modern equipment. They could not afford to clean the seminaries or to provide dormitories for those students who stayed there. They could not afford to pay for good quality food, good quality medicine for the boys consigned into them. In other words, conditions in the seminaries were generally speaking, pretty horrendous. There are some exceptions, particularly at the end of the 19th century when improvements began to be made. But conditions in these seminaries are firstly not conducive to learning, not conducive to taking on a future job as a priest, and thirdly, just generally pretty awful to subject young boys to. We have memoirs written by priests or the sons of priests after graduation, which often frame, use a literary device or sort of their childhood homes as being a heaven, a paradise, a sort of paradise before an Eden before sin, and then representing the seminary as almost a fall from paradise into hell. They were unventilated, smoky. Almost all reports we have of seminaries comment on the dirt and the grime that seemed impossible to remove. Teachers, generally speaking, were unmotivated, taken from the worst of the graduates from the very seminaries, in the very seminaries they were teaching in, the people who were not going to get priestly positions elsewhere, who had to go and work for these kind of salaries. Conditions in the dormitories, where some boys lived who had come from parishes very far from the seminaries, were also appalling, with students crammed into beds. Of course, this means there are hot pockets of disease, the spread of disease. There are two ways students could study in the seminary. They could either live there, or they could live in town. If they lived there, of course, then they were subject to the discipline of the seminary teachers and the seminary staff. Discipline which could be brutal in the extreme. Although technically beating the children in seminaries was forbidden by law, this certainly did not stop it happening. As a report, I believe it was from the 1840s, from Smolensk seminary, when the bishop visited, the screams from the seminary students being beaten were so loud that they drowned out the sound of the liturgical singing in the school. Other students lived in the town, in houses that they rented out with the money given to them by their parents. Another reason why sending your son to the seminary could be a burden. And of course, living outside of any kind of discipline, either parental or from the school. Well, these are children aged between 9 and 17. What happens when you have young boys with no discipline in a house by themselves? Well, of course, they engage in gambling, drinking, smoking, later, of course, visiting prostitutes, so on and so forth. So they were generally fighting, generally speaking. Seminarians in towns and villages, in the towns where seminaries were based, had an incredibly poor reputation because they were basically known as hooligans. A lot of these problems persist even into the 20th century. The problems of poor funding, for instance. But you can imagine this is not the environment in which you want to educate the priesthood, really. The priesthood was not really a place for a good career either. There wasn't really any place to go once you had achieved the rank of priest. In the Orthodox Church, as we're going to discuss tomorrow, in order to become a bishop, you need to be a monk. In other words, you have to be a member of the black clergy. So priests were of course, excluded. They could not ascend into the high ranks of church management. They could not gain an authoritative position in the church, regardless of their intelligence, regardless of their administrative acumen. Bishops, there were a few positions where a priest could obtain some degree of authority or power. For instance, to become head of the military clergy, in other words, the head of the army and navy priests, or to become head of the court clergy, in other words, the head of the priests who served the imperial family. These were prestigious, quite powerful positions. Occasionally, they were given votes in the synod in different periods. But generally speaking, there was not very much room for promotion. There was some. There was this bureaucratic hierarchy in the diocese. So, for instance, You could become a member of the ecclesiastical board of a district. You could become the dean of a diocese, meaning you were sort of a priest in charge of supervising other priests for the bishop. But there was a problem, is that those jobs were unsalaried. You didn't get paid for them. So while they might mean more prestige, perhaps more thanks, you didn't really get out of your economic condition. You weren't able to advance your economic status through gaining these particular jobs, through gaining these promotions. So this brings us on to discuss the economic condition, generally speaking, and in particular circumstances. So as we already discussed, most priests are dependent on small amounts of land attached to the church. They don't own that land, by the way. The land is attached to the church building itself, not to them as priests, which they farm, they produce food, they keep that food to feed themselves and their families, and if they have more than they need, they can sell it in the marketplace or to their neighbours, for instance. They rely on irregular parishioner payments for things like marriages, baptisms, etc., etc. They're reliant on donations that peasants might make to the church, if they feel like it. And on this economic basis, they're expected to support themselves, to support their wives, to provide dowries for their daughters, to provide money for their sons who cannot find a position. They're expected to pay taxes for the seminaries. They're expected to pay for their sons who go to seminaries, who have to pay, in most cases, have to pay a fee to enter the seminary, and also, generally speaking, have to pay for accommodation, for food, while staying in the seminary town. Unsurprisingly, most priests are therefore poor, extremely poor, despite the fact that they have, generally speaking, a high level of education and a high level of social status. Extremely poor, well-educated, with a degree of social status. Well, it's unsurprising that a lot of priests grew up feeling resentful of their lot in the world. Of course, as in all things in history and in life, this is a generalization, and wealth could vary. If you're a priest in a city, for instance, in a wealthy district of a city in particular, let's say a district in Moscow inhabited by wealthy merchants, or an area in St. Petersburg with a lot of nobles, well then, of course, your situation was very different. You could expect large donations and large payments from wealthy merchant and aristocratic parishioners. Sometimes the church you served in had buildings attached to it, which were rented out to people, and you as the priest got a share of that rent. Sometimes these churches in large cities often were able to establish bank accounts, capital accounts, and they were able to pay the priests from the interest earned on the capital accounts. So therefore, working in a city or an urban environment was often very beneficial for a priest, especially if it was in a prominent cathedral or church. It could mean a good salary. Some nobles, in fact, had their own house churches, where they would directly employ a priest to work in them. And unsurprisingly, that meant a regular salary and, generally speaking, fairly good conditions. I've given you an example here, for instance, a contrast of how an urban salary could differ and a rural salary. So in the town of Klazin, which is in Tver province, the priests collectively received 4,400 rubles in payment. This is, in 1830, a huge amount of money. This is more than a lot of nobles would earn. But in a tiny village in the same diocese, Novogorodskaya, they earned only 80 rubles a year, which had to be shared by the priest, among the priests who worked there, so among the priest, deacon, and the sacristan, and among their families. That's worth noting, by the way, just in case you didn't think their positions were difficult enough already. There wasn't just one priest in most parishes. There was the priest, a deacon, and a psalmist, sacristan. So you had the three ranks of people. So you'd often have 3 members of the clergy in each parish, on average. And that 80 rubles is being shared out among 3 people. And so really, they're not earning a lot more than their peasant parishioners do. They're in pretty much the same position, economic position. In the 18th century, it goes without saying, as in Russia, as elsewhere, discipline was an extremely harsh matter. We have records of bishops chaining difficult priests to trees, administering beatings with their hands, and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, the bishop, throughout the period, had more or less unlimited power over the priests he commanded. The bishop was the authority who could punish a priest, promote a priest, or even throw a priest out of his position, defrock him. By the way, that's the definition of that term. Defrock means to be deprived of your priesthood, to be thrown away from your priesthood, to be removed from the priesthood. Okay? Generally speaking, if you were a priest who behaved badly, whose service was not up to standard, if you made mistakes, if you incurred complaints, etc., 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 then generally speaking, these would incur a minor punishment, which were fines. We've already discussed how poor most priests were, so even this kind of minor form of punishment can be quite devastating to a priest's personal economy in poor village parishes. The next step up was to suspend you from service for a time. So in other words, let's say you'd been caught being drunk as a priest, well, maybe the bishop would say, well, you cannot give the liturgy or perform spiritual services for 3 months. But remember, where does the priest get his money? From doing religious services. So being deprived of those services for 3 months risks that he and his family will be impoverished, be ruined by the punishment. Well, if you did something really bad, then you would be sent to do a penance in a monastery. So in other words, you'd be sent to a monastery and locked in a cell for however long the bishop or the synod had determined was necessary for you to learn the severity of your crime. Monasteries and convents, as we discussed tomorrow, often performed this role as places of punishment for members of the clerical estate. You'd basically be locked away in a very uncomfortable cell, forced to attend the very rigorous cycle of religious ceremonies in the monastery or convent until you were judged to redeem yourself. And of course, you had to pay for your journey to the monastery and back from the monastery. And while you're in the monastery prison, you aren't earning money. So your family, again, you and your family face impoverishment if you work in a poor parish. And then finally, the ultimate punishment being defrocked. As I mentioned, being thrown out of the priesthood altogether, which meant, generally speaking, then you were going to become either a peasant or a townsman, which meant you and your family would now be subject to conscription, to physical punishment, and to the poll tax. So in other words, if discipline was severe and had real consequences for priests who, for one reason or another, through lack of personal talent, through mistake, or through intention, committed errors which were judged to be against the laws of the state and the church. So then, I think it's obvious there were problems with the clerical estate. There were problems with the priesthood, clearly. Already by the beginning of the 19th century, it's obvious. There are too many useless priest sons in the church. They are too heavy a burden. And we can't send them all to the army or into different estates. Something has to be done. Well, and of course they're aware of this system of priests inheriting their positions from their fathers or from their fathers-in-laws. This is also, of course, not ideal. So one step is taken in 1823 is to essentially establish what are called welfare boards in every diocese. And basically what these are collections of priests in each diocese who gather some money together, collect money in order to provide some basic kind of welfare for other priests in the diocese. They could be pensions, or they could be payments to the very poorest parishes. Perhaps they might give them money to support their sons in the seminaries, and so on and so forth. In other words, there is a collective attempt in the priesthood to try and use its collective wealth to aid to improve its own economic situation. But the basic problem remained. There were no salaries for the priesthood. And while that remained the case, the priests would remain dependent entirely, or almost entirely, on their parishioners, and therefore under the power of their parishioners. They could not really serve the state in the role they wanted them to serve as leaders of the village, enforcers of order, both moral and legal order. But there's still the fact that the synod does not receive enough money to pay the clergy salaries. And so they try and work out some ways around this. So, for instance, in 1842, Nicholas I tries to make sure that the clergy are better paid for by ordering that peasants have to give them more land, have to give them wood, which they can either use themselves for firewood or building materials, or which they can sell, and that peasants have to provide them with a house. Well, you can imagine this doesn't improve particularly relationships between parishioners and clergy. Because now you're being told as a peasant or a parishioner, well, you have to give your new priest, you have to go and build him a house with your own materials. You have to give him wood. You have to give him more land. That's less land that you have to farm, more to the priest. Of course, most parishioners are not particularly interested in doing this. There was an attempt to reduce the number of clergy. So basically, as I mentioned, to say there were usually three clergy per church. The priest, the deacon, and the sacristan. There was an attempt to remove the number of deacons attached to most churches. And the argument therefore was, well then, the amount of money that the church receives from the peasants would be shared between two priests rather than three, between two clergy rather than three. But of course, this also sort of backfires because then you've taken yet away another position that potentially sons of the clergy could have held. You're reducing the number of jobs at the same time when you're still increasing the number of priestly sons going through these seminaries. Okay? You're trying to increase the salaries of the priests by reducing the number of jobs available, while at the same time training more and more and more recruits. So of course this doesn't help matters. Now, in some areas of the Russian Empire, priests were regarded as being vital supporters of the Russian state, particularly in areas like Poland, in the western provinces. Let's remember, in the beginning of the 1830s, the Poles had rebelled against the Russian Empire. The Russian priests, therefore, are regarded as necessary servants of the state and, to a degree, even at this point, of Russian culture in these non-Russian areas. And so, gradually, some kind of salaries begins to be extended to these individuals in particular. Priests in the borderlands began to receive money from the state for their services. It has to be said, however, these salaries were still pretty low. 180 to 220 rubles, of course, is better than most peasants earn, but still, this is not a secure existence as we would term it today. This is a difficult sum to raise a family on, for instance. All of these attempts to roll out measures to support the clergy are resisted by the peasantry, meaning that they are very limited in extent. After a decade, did I give the date? No, I don't give a date. After a decade or so, after a couple of decades, for instance, of insisting by law that parishioners pay more, give their priests more land, build houses, etc., a survey was conducted, and it was found that only 25% of parishes had gained these houses, this additional wood, this additional land. Because, as I mentioned, the peasants, unsurprisingly, resisted making these contributions. Oh yes, and there. Well, if you wanted a figure that's more or less makes it clear just how big the problem of of useless clergy was. Well, 71% in Vladimir diocese in 1850. 71% of clergy, of members of the clerical estate, male members of the clerical estate, did not have jobs. They were essentially superfluous sons. And what did they do? Well, of course, they sat at home, to a large extent being supported by their fathers, maybe assisting in agriculture, maybe sometimes taking jobs at seminaries if they were going. Sometimes other dioceses in places like Siberia or the Far East or the Caucasus might offer them jobs. But these were not necessarily attractive. After all, you had to travel thousands of miles into difficult and dangerous conditions to take on these borderland parishes. So the initial reforms did not solve the problems. In many cases, they made them worse. Now, of course, as in other areas of Russian society, the great reforms under Alexander II in the 1860s proved transformative. What did the state do to try and improve the condition of the clergy during these reforms? Well, basically, the first step was to try and abolish the clerical estate. What do I mean by that? To basically mean that you could now enter and exit from the clerical estate. You could enter from the outside, from any of the other social groups, and if you were a priest, you could leave it, or the son of a priest, you could leave it, without penalties. The sons of priests who were given who wanted to leave the clerical estate were given, upon their exit, were given personal nobility. Basically meaning that they now had the same position, the same kind of status as, for instance, civil servants in Russian society. They were no longer they were no longer being punished for leaving the clerical estate. That meant the sons of the clergy should go and do other jobs in areas where their education was required. They could, for instance, go and be teachers in the newly emerging village schools. They could go and become lawyers or journalists or writers. They could attend the universities, be students. They could go and become bureaucrats. So in other words, this was the basic solution to the overcrowding problem in the clerical estate. All of these sons who had no other job, who had no way of getting a position at a church, could now leave and go and find jobs or education elsewhere without any penalties being imposed or any other kind of detrimental effects. Still, there is no particular decision on how to fund the clergy, however. In 1864, what they create are parish guardianships. So the idea is that in each parish you establish a voluntary body, and the guardianship will collect money from parishioners that will be used to give the priests a wage. It sounds good in theory, but we're going to see it's not good in practice. And drawing from the experience of 1823, when the clergy formed welfare boards to support their own poorest individuals, this kind of collective experience was used again to create what became known as diocesan congresses of clergy, where the clergy of all the dioceses would meet together and try and resolve particularly financial issues of how to support seminaries, how to support poor priests, how to support the widows and orphans of priests. These usually tried to collect some money together, either by drawing donations from the clergy, donations from other members of other estates, or donations from the government, or from the synod, and try to distribute this money fairly, according to need. But of course, still, the question is, there is no salary being provided. And the Great Reforms, they certainly resolve the staffing problem, but this in itself has consequences. Because suddenly, now you can go and do any job you like. You can leave the clerical estate if you want to, and a lot of people wanted to. Before you had little choice whether you became a priest or not. You were born the son of a clergyman, you became a priest. Now you could leave. Now you could go and take education in secular institutions. And when you left, you got a relatively high social status and high and prestigious social status. So unsurprisingly, what we actually have now is the opposite occurs. The church has a manpower problem because its most educated people are going to take on more well-paying jobs. This emerges rapidly after the reforms in 1864 are launched. After the reforms in 1860s are launched, it's already clear by the 1880s that there are problems finding enough qualified people to staff all of the parishes. There is basically what we would call today brain drain. The clergy loses its best and brightest sons to other, better paying, more prestigious professions. Oh, yes, I should mention, of course, yes. There's also the problem. Of course, when I say the clerical estate was opened, I mean it was opened, you couldn't just leave now, but other groups could join it. So if you're a peasant and you wanted your child or you wanted to become a priest, or if you're a nobleman and you wanted your child or you wanted to become a priest, well then you could enter the seminaries, gain certificates, and therefore become a priest. Now, this seemingly would be one solution to the flight of people from the clergy, from the clerical estate, from jobs as priests. However, it doesn't work in that way. Basically, for the nobles, becoming a priest is a step down. The nobles, for them, mostly regard the priests as a group with a degree of contempt. For them, the priests, different kinds of education, the priests' non-European habits, the priests living among their parishioners, often being forced to do agricultural work, but then not many nobles wanted to become priests. For the peasants, the problem was, well, some of them might have wanted to become priests, but there were economic boundaries in the way. For instance, paying the seminary fees to send your children. Paying the fees to join the seminary, for instance. So basically, as the clerical estate flees from the clergy, it's unable to recruit from other social states, like the nobility and peasantry, even though technically they can now enter. Thus, we see a decline in the educational standards of the priesthood, because now the church begins to have to assign parishes, not as it done before, to seminarians who had graduated with the best grades, but rather seminarians with perhaps achieving average or low grades, or in some cases to seminarians who hadn't even completed the course, or to in some cases even to individuals who had never been to a seminary at all. So basically, the educational standard of the clergy by the end of the 19th century declines. I've given you the figure here for your reading when you want to see it. Two of the other measures introduced by the church also didn't work particularly well. These parish guardianships, essentially the collection of parishioners meant to try and fund their priest by gathering money collectively. Well, the thing was, when they created them, it turned out the parishioners weren't much interested in giving money to the priests. The parishioners, generally speaking, were much more interested in making the church beautiful. They wanted to upgrade it from wood to stone. They wanted to build a bell tower, buy a new iconostasis, buy new icons with gold, silver or bronze frames, buy new buy new clerical robes for the priest. But they weren't really particularly interested in giving money to salaries, to the priest's salaries. I've given you a figure here. Chernigov, today Chernihiv in Ukraine. The parish guardianships out of that diocese, 93% of the sums they gathered did not go to the clergy, who only received 2% of the total money of the total money gathered. And I also mentioned here, a lot of parishes were not rapid in creating these parish guardianships either. Only by the beginning of the 20th century can we say that most parishes had some kind of form of guardianship, but even then it certainly was not anywhere near total coverage. But again, let's have a look at one of the good sides of these reforms. As I mentioned beforehand, if you became a priest, you did so because you were the son of the priest. You were born into this job. You didn't really have a say in what career you had. And so, unsurprisingly, a lot of people who simply through accident of birth were forced to take on a job that they weren't suited for, that they didn't want, they didn't have an aptitude for. Well, of course, with the opening of the clerical estate, this means the people who remain priests, the people who continue to seek out priestly jobs, these are the people they want to become priests. They consider themselves able to become priests. They like being priests for a variety of reasons. Maybe they see this as a form of service to the people. Maybe they are truly and deeply religious. For a variety of different reasons. But in other words, therefore, you have now a cohort of clergy who generally want to be there. And what this means is increasingly the nature of the clergy is changing. It's changing from an estate job, given because you were born in an estate, is turning into a freely chosen profession with its own professional standards and criteria. And this new kind of clergy, this new professional clergy, increasingly defines itself not in the way, the old way, in basically that they are deliverers of the sacraments. They increasingly see themselves as teachers, as leaders, as guides, as helpers to their peasant parishioners. These are increasing the skills that have been given to them by the seminaries, by church literature, which is increasingly being published and made available through cheap printing by the end of the 19th century. So there are positive sides to positives as well as negatives to the Great Reforms. And increasingly, what you are seeing by 1905 is the emergence of a professional pastorate rather than an estate clergy. And good, we're coming towards the end anyway. I'll try and be brief. I know we're out of time. Increasingly, there is an awareness of their a collective awareness of their limited position within the church. There is a collective consciousness of the problems of their position and of the people, of the causes of their problems and the potential solution to their problems. And this leads to what the great historian of the Russian clergy, Gregory Fries, calls clerical liberalism, where priests began to identify the root of their problems in the lack of their voice in the church. They had very few ruling positions in the church. They were not bishops. They generally did not sit in the synod. They had no part, they could take no part in the management of the church as a body, both in the centre and in the diocese. Under Alexander II, the idea of transparency, or glasnost, led the state to sponsor openly criticisms of the existing order in order to try and find an idea of how to reform various aspects of the state, including the clerical estate. And so clergy were invited to make criticisms. Priests, deacons, sacristans were invited to make criticisms of the church. And what they found was that basically there was a split between the bishops and the priests, or the monastic orders and the priests, with priests resenting the monastic control politically, economically, socially, culturally over the church. And they began to stand together as a group, demanding that the priesthood be given a greater degree of control in the church. Not just the priesthood, however. Working with parishioners day in, day out, gave them a degree of sympathy for their laity. And they increasingly demanded that their believers, the believers of the Orthodox Church, should be allowed a say in their religious lives by electing priests, perhaps even by electing bishops. Now, I know we're out of time, and I'll try and be brief. I want to try and give you a concrete example of what I've been talking about today. And so I have here Belustin, Johann. He was born in Tver in 18. So Tver, it's northwest of Moscow. Well, you can probably get there in 3 or 4 hours by car, I think. He was born in 1839, and precisely born to a priestly family. He was the son of a priest. And of course, therefore, it was immediately expected that he would become a priest. He had no other way of exiting the clerical estate, and so he was sent to the seminary in Tver. Upon graduation from the seminary, Belustin did very well. He achieved the highest grades possible, and indeed there was some talk about him going to the Moscow Ecclesiastical Academy. So remember, that is the church equivalent of a university. However, at the same time, he was offered in marriage the daughter of a priest. And the priest basically promised him, his future father-in-law basically promised him, well, you marry my daughter, and here's a secure parish for you. You can take the parish, have its income, and that's secure for you. If you go to the academy, well, who knows what's going to happen to you? Come take this position, you marry my young daughter, 18 years old, well, you'll be looked after. So he did. So he decided to put aside his dreams of getting a further education, and he married the young priest's daughter, and therefore became the principal priest of his father-in-law's parish. Of course, he had to agree to look after his father-in-law and his new mother-in-law as part of that deal. Well, it didn't go particularly well for Beljustin, as he described in his diaries, in his later memoir, between the years he spent in that parish that he obtained through marrying the priest's daughter, 1840 to 1842, he describes as the worst in his life. He found performing agricultural work, which he'd had no training for in the seminary, to be derogatory, demeaning, difficult, hard. He found the fact that he had to argue with his parishioners over money for baptisms, marriages, funerals, and so on, other rituals. He found insulting to his position as the priest. As he described it here, I'll read this out. 12 years of study gave absolutely nothing, or almost nothing, for this rural pastorship. What is the use of memorizing ancient languages? I was very well versed in the literature of the Greeks and Romans, but what was the point? To read the church fathers, but where would I find copies? Well, very fortunately, his intellectual talents were recognized, and in 1844, he, along with his wife and young family, were able to transfer to a town with a large cathedral, which meant, relatively speaking, he would earn more money. It's an urban area with a large cathedral where there were richer parishioners who generally were able to donate more to the church, to donate more to the support of the priest. Well, Beljustin got himself, about a decade later, involved in some controversy. So the reign of Alexander II has begun, and Alexander II is beginning to ask for criticisms of the church. And Beljustin had penned an extremely critical attack on the bishops, but also the state of the clergy in Russia. He had sent this document to the famous Moscow historian Pogodin in 1857. Pogodin initially wanted him to publish it. Beljustin refused, because Beljustin knew what would happen if he published this under his name. Bad things, basically, would come to him. But Pogodin decided to ignore Beljustin and publish it anyway. Well, it didn't. Initially, things did not go well. Beljustin's criticism of the bishops, of the administration of the church, of the synod, and of the condition of the clergy was extraordinarily sharp. I've given you an example here. The white clergy is governed by monks. What an anomaly. Can a monk understand the conditions, needs, and demands of family life? Can he sympathize with the invariably bitter conditions of the priest living on 200 to 300 rubles, trying to support and educate sons to provide his daughters with a dowry? Initially, this statement was published in Leipzig. It very quickly made its way back into Russia, where it was read by the bishops, but was also, and very fortunate for Beljustin, read by the Tsar. One of the Tsar's advisors recommended he read it. The synod was preparing to punish Beljustin for having spoken so freely and so openly against the bishops and against the church. Fortunately, because Alexander had read this account, he admired it, he thought it showed an open, honest, and clear view of the problems of the clergy, Alexander II stepped in and ordered the synod to stop its criminal proceedings against Beljustin, which meant that basically he was saved from the sentence they had prepared for him, which was exile to the White Sea and to the Solovetsky monastery, which was often been used as a prison not only in Imperial Russia but also in Soviet Russia. Here we have an example precisely of somebody who lived and breathed the problems of the clerical estate, somebody who had received this education, received precisely a higher understanding of his own intellectual gifts, of his purpose, his role, but had been shown the poverty, the dependence on the clergy, dependence on the parishioners, on the peasantry, the sheer difficulty of trying to maintain the prestige of your job and your social position and of your religious role in these kind of social economic conditions. And so he wrote a protest against them, one which is still regarded today as being one of the epitomes, the first manifestations of clerical liberalism, an attack on the bishops and a demand for the priests to have more say in the church or in the church government, so that the church government understands and grasps precisely the problems of the parish clergy that the bishops, the monastic bishops, could never truly understand. Oh dear. 2 hours, god damn it. So let's very briefly summarize as quickly as we can what we've talked about today. So basically the clergy was a closed estate. You couldn't leave without problems, without entering the tax-paying conscription-liable estates. You couldn't enter or various other punishments, various other penalties that could be imposed for leaving. You couldn't enter the clerical estate because the seminaries were only for the sons of priests, and only through seminary education could you become priests. Because the priests had no pensions, they needed their sons to support them by remaining in the same parish, or by at least obtaining a job. Therefore, priests essentially became hereditary. Priesthood essentially became hereditary in Imperial Russia up until the 1860s, when the opening of the clerical estate made it possible to enter and leave from the position. Okay? The synod lacked the funds, so the synod and the government lacked the funds to provide salaries to the clergy for most of the 18th and 19th centuries. Even in the early 20th century, it was estimated that about a third of the clergy were still not being paid salaries. And even when you did receive a salary, it was not guaranteed to cover the costs of maintaining your family, of sending your sons to the seminaries, of providing for your elderly or otherwise disabled relatives, of providing for adult sons who couldn't find a position. Basically, the priesthood is defined by a hereditary succession, by education in the seminary, and by a poor economic position. And this poor economic position often translated into low social prestige. Despite their levels of education, they were certainly looked down upon by the nobility, who despised them because of their poverty. When we've discussed how the reforms tried to solve this issue, there was initially attempts to try and get parishioners to provide the priest with more, but the parishioners proved reluctant. Remember that most parishioners, they don't do this out of malice towards the priest or dislike of the priest. They live hard enough lives themselves. And they've been asked to build a house for the priest, to give him more land, to give him precious firewood, when they themselves are struggling to make ends meet. Of course, in some areas this was different. In cities, for example, where you had wealthy merchants, wealthy aristocrats who went to the church, potentially who went to the church, yes, you could receive more money. But generally, you would have parishioners who could support you at a good and high level. But in the most cases, not. In the countryside, Russia was an overwhelmingly rural empire. The priests were poor and their parishioners were poor. Parishioners were not really willing or able to support giving more means to support their priests. Gradually, salaries were rolled out, but the major way of trying to reform this was firstly by opening the clerical estate, letting all of these priestly sons who could not find a position in the church leave to go and find their fortune somewhere else, therefore relieving their families of the economic burden, hopefully, of keeping them and maintaining them without jobs. But of course, this led to professionalization on the one hand. Now you could go and get your jobs elsewhere, while the people who remained, of course, were people who generally wanted to be priests. But on the other hand, you had a decline, obviously, in educational levels. You could no longer maintain this permanent stock of seminarians. You could no longer simply give priestly positions to the person with the highest grades. Now the people with the highest grades are leaving for other jobs. So you're forced to rely on people with less successful educational records, or maybe even people who have not finished the seminary, or people who have not gone to seminary at all. And so educational levels, the clergy fall. Basically, from 100% level of seminary certification in the 1850s, by the end of the 19th century, it's about 70 or so percent. I think this the low economic standard, the low social prestige, and the lack of possibilities for promotion generated this idea of clerical liberalism. The idea that the problem with the church was its domination by bishops, which meant the priests had little say in how things were run, and that the way things were run did not reflect the priest's needs. Remember what Baldusin said. How can a monk, like a bishop, know what it is to support sons studying in the seminary or provide daughters with dowries? How can they have any conception? And so increasingly, priests are beginning to demand that they have a greater role in the church. In 1905, this begins to form into even definitive political movements demanding reforms from the church from the clerical estate. Okay? Right, thank you. So, any questions after all that?
I have some question. You explained before that some money that they collect voluntary groups of parishioners, they were used to make church and to make them more beautiful. Mm-hmm. So is it how many churches changes from wood to?
Yes, I mean basically the synod very rarely provided money to upgrade churches. They very rarely provided money for building churches at all. Only in some parts of the empire, in the Baltic states and in Poland, did they actually build churches on the synod's money. They often asked is that, did parishioners have enough money to build their own church and to maintain them? So parishioners usually paid for the building of their church. So unsurprisingly, therefore, this is another problem, is that parishioners, of course, regarded their churches as their property, as their community's property, and not belonging to the priest and not belonging to the synod. And they wanted a right, a voice in how it was governed. Well, often they simply didn't have that, or had a very limited voice. So, of course, this is a tension between the clergy and the parishioners, is precisely how is the church managed? How is it beautified? What is done with it? How is it administered? The parishioners think, well, we pay for the priest and we pay for the church building. So why shouldn't we have a say in how this is run? Okay?
And so even with icons?
Yes, they are. They often bought their own icons, yes. I mean, it was, icons, of course, could vary between, a piece of paper from a huge solid piece of wood with gold frames, jewels, emeralds, diamonds around it by an extremely qualified iconographer. Of course, sometimes these were donated. Sometimes a bishop might donate an icon, a noble might donate an icon, and so on and so forth. But very often they would pay for their buying. They would pay to purchase. They would pay for icons, yes. No problem. Any further yes?
You mentioned the schooling system. It was based on Latin culture mostly. So I thought Orthodox Church is a kind of different world, but it drives the church also, the front line of church to Western, very much only literacy stays.
The question is, of course, how much Latin did they actually learn through this system? And really, I'd imagine a lot of people didn't truly learn a lot of Latin from being there. But you're absolutely right. It's a useless language for an Orthodox priest to learn. I mean, Old Church Slavonic obviously would be the language necessary for conducting liturgy. Russian was the language they spoke in everyday life. Even Greek, at least because of Greek Orthodoxy, you'd be able to read theology in old works of theology in the original language. I don't know if it how far it can be said to westernize the clergy. It's an interesting question. Certainly, later the clergy regard themselves as being an authentically Russian, non-westernized class, as opposed to the nobility who had attended languages like French and German or English and so on and so forth in schools, where they said, well, we are a more authentic Russian national leadership group. So I don't know, but certainly in the period where Latin dominates in the schools, it does reflect the westward-looking perspective of the church's leadership.
And the second one is, you mentioned the school, then this state introduced a full schooling system from childhood to university. How much priests could get this education? Only 6 years was this first seminary.
No, most priest sons would go to the church schools, for instance, from the lower church schools. Many priest sons, of course, they would be raised by their fathers, so they would already get some knowledge of literacy from their fathers, and they would also get some knowledge of how rituals were conducted and so on and so forth in the churches. But certainly priests' sons did attend these lower levels of the church education system. The higher level, the university, the ecclesiastical academy, this was an elite education. Very, very few priests. Only those lucky enough to have the highest grades with some kind of sponsor or backer to fund their further education would go to the academies. We're going to discuss the academies a bit more tomorrow, because tomorrow we're going to discuss the black clergy, so the bishops and the monks, and the bishops were the main people who used the ecclesiastical academies, okay? Any further questions, comments? Okay then, good. Let's finish then.